Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Ashley Johnson, and I'm here with my friend Jim Sullivan, who is, I guess, what would you say, a contractor, somebody that works with the Alzheimer's Association.
Well, I'm
But
a volunteer community educator.
there we go. And we've had programs with Jim before, and he's very knowledgeable and passionate about the subject. So I'm going to just kind of hand it over to him and we're going to get started. As mentioned before, if you have questions, please use the chat feature or the Q&A. And I am recording this, so I will share it with people who have registered. And we encourage you to share it with people in your life who might find value in the information that we're going to share today. So with that, Jim, thank you so much for showing up. And I'm just right behind this black square. So if you need any help with anything, I'm here and listening.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. Good morning. As Ashley said, my name is Jim Sullivan. I'm a volunteer community educator for the Alzheimer's Association. In the title, this 800 number, 272-3900, is the number for the Alzheimer's Association 24/7 hotline, where you can get assistance if you have any questions or need resources and are working with a loved one, a family member with Alzheimer's disease. It's a great organization, and they have just a lot of information that is very, very helpful. At the bottom of my presentation is my contact information, my 800 number, and I have an extension. I also have an email. I'm actually, in addition to being a volunteer community educator, I run a nonprofit organization called Pay for Care. The motivation behind that is that I grew up in a family with 6 kids. About 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, my older sister, Kathy, died of a rare dementia called Binswanger's. It's a vascular dementia. It's not the same as Alzheimer's, but she had been diagnosed probably in 2016, 17. It was a very rare form of dementia. In fact, I used to tease Kathy. We grew up in Wisconsin, and I said Binswanger's to me sounds more like a bratwurst than it does a vascular dementia. But she had been diagnosed. It progressed fairly rapidly. She didn't die of it, though. As with a lot of chronic or terminal illnesses, Kathy actually died because as she neared the end of her struggle with Binswanger's, she was losing her most basic bodily functions. You lose your highest functions first, then you lose your basic bodily functions last, as many of you know. And she had forgotten how to swallow. The nurses at her nursing home left her alone briefly to eat lunch, and she choked on the food, their lunch. And by the time they were able to get to her, dislodge the food, in addition to the damage that had already been done to her brain because of the Binswanger's vascular dementia, the doctor suggested suggested to my brother-in-law and her 3 kids that she be pulled off life support, which they did, and she passed on a day or two later. Then in October of 2022, my older brother, Rick, died of Alzheimer's disease. He was diagnosed probably about 3 years before that, but as many of you know, nowadays Alzheimer's, the signs of it appear many, many years before the clinical symptoms appear. So Rick deteriorated fairly quickly. He lived in Kansas City. He worked for the Federal Reserve. He had a PhD in economics. But even though he had what many people call brain reserve, the better educated you are, the more, I think the thinking was, your brain is good at making and maintaining new connections. But for Rick, his Alzheimer's progressed fairly rapidly, and he died on October 2nd of 2022. Rick, near the end, he went from having Alzheimer's with no personality changes to, as he got near the end of his disease journey, he became increasingly agitated and even struck out at some of the nurses at his nursing home facility. And you know what that means. That means you have to either they required Rick to either be put on mood altering drugs, or they couldn't keep him at the facility. So that was a tough journey for Rick and my sister-in-law, Leslie. So of their 6 kids, we've lost 2 now to dementia. And that's where part of my CPA practice had actually been working with families where a family member had been diagnosed with a chronic or terminal illness. That was just coincidental. So I worked with a lot of families where a loved one was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. And so my practice was specialized. And then I ended up with 2 of my siblings going through their own journey with dementia. And that's when I started Pay for Care, because even though I would consider my family lucky in the sense we did have some resources to help pay for care and caregiving, that isn't true for most people. It is very expensive. Dementia is a very expensive disease given the caregiving requirements that are not usually paid for by Medicare. And so I wanted to start a nonprofit entity that helped all families deal with the financial struggles of dementia. And for those families, we charge a modest fee, but for those families who can't afford our fees, we have scholarships available. So we never turn anybody away because they can't afford our services. To me, that's when I worked with families that had been diagnosed, someone had been diagnosed, say, with Lou Gehrig's disease. It was bad enough to be diagnosed, but then not to have the resources to plan properly, to me, was a horrible situation. And that's what Pay for Care was developed to address. So how do we approach management of the financial issues that accompany the diagnosis of chronic or terminal illness? And here you've got a 2-page handout, key takeaways that we're going to go through. And my approach is a little different. We aren't talking necessarily about financial planning, because the time for planning is over once you get the diagnosis. Now we're talking about financial problem solving, because with the diagnosis of these diseases, it impacts all aspects of the household finances, and every household is going to be a little different in which aspects of finances are impacted. And so we're going to go through some of those things like credit card debt, healthcare debt, looking for money to help pay for care. Each is a separate problem that we need to solve as part of our exercise. So when you get this diagnosis, there's a lot of anxiety that comes with it, of course. The biggest to me is, at least initially, the financial issues. How are you going to pay for the care that's needed? Your old financial plan is broken, is what I tell families. We need to create a new approach to help deal with the new reality of the diagnosis of these diseases. And what we want to do is be proactive. The worst thing you can do, I think, is to sit back and not do anything. That only increases your anxiety. Oftentimes you imagine problems as being worse than they really are. And so by being proactive, I think you improve the life of not only the person diagnosed with Alzheimer's or other dementia, but also with the financial caregiver. And that's here who we really aim this seminar or webinar at. the financial caregiver, the person in the family who's responsible for making decisions about the finances associated with the cost of the disease. And so in conjunction with working with the financial caregiver, we also work with the patient. And if your family's anything like mine, you find out with my older brother, Rick, given his academic background, he did all the household finances. My sister-in-law, Leslie, has advanced degrees in public health. So she actually taught at the Kansas University School of Medicine, but she had no interest in the financial planning for the household. That was all Rick's job. I grew up in a family where that was typically, and this was unusual in the 60s and 70s, where the financial planning was all done by my mom. My dad was a book salesman, out of the house frequently on sales trips, and she was the one. And I thought that was natural that the mother, the wife, took over the job of financial planning, but that wasn't true in all families. So whoever controls or has that particular talent is the one that is usually doing the caregiving. And if that's not, and if that turns out to be the ill partner, then we work with the well partner to teach them how to go through and make some of these decisions and solve these problems. The other thing I always tell families at the beginning is this is a different type of financial problem solving. We're often going to be talking about picking the best option from a poor list of choices, of alternatives. And that's really a natural outgrowth because this diagnosis is often unexpected, wasn't planned for early on. And so as we go through the process, I may end up making 5 suggestions about what alternatives are available, all of which are not great, but you're going to have to pick the best option in order to be able to solve your financial problems as best we can. So let's start with a more recent client of mine. Her name was Tess. Tess lived downstate Illinois in Urbana, and her mom, who was a widow, had mild cognitive impairment and was slowly deteriorating. And Tess decided she was going to leave, sell her home in Urbana, quit her job, move up to the southwest suburbs, and take care of her mother. She was an only child, so there weren't any siblings that she could rely on to provide care. Her dad had died years earlier. So now Tess's issue became, how do I move up there without a job and financially survive taking care of my mother? The first thing I always tell clients is we need to do a benefits inventory. What is a benefit inventory? That is really nothing more than taking a look at in this case, Tess's mom, and deciding what benefits is she eligible for. And by that, I mean federal, state, local benefit, government provided programs, deciding what she's eligible for and what she may not have applied for. Now, in Tess's mom's case, she was eligible, she was on Medicare because she was over age 65. But because she had very limited income, she only had Social Security as her monthly income and a very small pension. She owned the home she lived in, owned a car, but no longer drove. She actually was eligible for not only Medicare, but Medicaid. So she is what we call dual eligible for both Medicare and Medicaid. And Tess wasn't aware of these rules. And that makes sense because most of us, when this happens, are new to this financial caregiving process and aren't aware of many of the benefits that are out there. So the first thing we did, we determined that Tess's mom was eligible for Medicaid. We applied for Medicaid. And what that did it saved her several $100s a month because Medicare on its own does not pay 100% of healthcare bills. There are co-payments, co-insurance, annual deductibles you have to worry about. And to pay for those, many people buy what are called a Medicare supplement or Medigap plan. That by itself, depending on the age of the Medicare beneficiary, can cost several $100s. When my mother-in-law passed away a couple of years ago, she was a little over 100 years old. Her monthly Medigap premium was over $300, which was expensive. She was with Blue Cross Blue Shield, with a company she thought a great deal of. So I never tried to suggest she move to Price Shop because it is not worth it. If they're comfortable where they're at, unless you absolutely have to, leave it alone. So for the last several years of my mother-in-law's life, she was with Blue Cross Blue Shield. But by moving to Medicaid, being dual eligible, having Medicare and Medicaid, you're able to drop that Medigap plan, and that saved, in this case with Tess, several $100s a month, which was needed in terms of having such a tight budget. Now, my mother-in-law did not qualify for Medicaid, so she kept her Medicare supplement plan. So we're doing a benefits inventory. We've looked at Medicaid. Some people are eligible for what's called the low income subsidy or extra help, meaning when you have Part D of Medicare, that covers prescription drug needs. And Part D also does not pay for all of prescription drug costs. So if you're depending on your income and asset level, you may qualify for the low income subsidy, or it's also known as extra help. And most people don't realize they're eligible for this plan. In fact, somewhere around 40 or 50% of people out there are eligible for these benefit programs, but don't take advantage of them. And that's the very first thing we want to do when we're working with the household is ask that question. What plans are out there? What are you in? And what are you possibly eligible for? Because a lot of people leave money on the table because they aren't aware or sufficiently educated about these programs. So we go through and we look at the benefits inventory. We may be able to find money just by enrolling the ill spouse, ill partner, or parent in these benefit programs. And then we move on to the next issue. Under 2B, we create what I call a care budget. So in other words, we're going to look at what is the impact on income and expenses of the diagnosis of these diseases. And income and expenses are both impacted. Now think about when Tess moved to the southwest suburbs, she quit her job, so no longer had a source of revenue. She moved up to live with her mom. Her mom had limited income, so their income was impacted right away. Tess wanted to stay home, or it was really necessary for her to stay home and care for her mom because it was dangerous for her mom just to be left alone during the day while Tess worked. So the income dropped. There were new expenses and growing expenses over the time related to the cost of care for Tess's mom. So we're going to do a short-term budget of anywhere from 12 to 18 months and take a look at the impact on income and expenses and determine whether or not there's going to be a shortfall. Now, in most families' cases, there is a shortfall. The news is rarely good, but that's where I tell family, rather than worrying about this, let's get to work. We'll begin to work on the care budget and decide what help is out there that may close that gap between income and expenses to help you pay for care. What other programs might be available? Now, one good trend, I think, in Medicare is there's a new program called the Medicare Guide Program. It is specifically aimed at providing additional support for home caregivers. It's meant to do what Medicare, to me, has not done much in the past, which is to provide guidance for caregivers where the ill parent, spouse, or partner is at home, and they create a support group for the caregiver to help them better manage the financial caregiving and the care for their loved one. So the Medicare Guide Program is already underway. You can be in many areas. The other thing that's available now is under Medicare, you as the caregiver can actually get a Medicare paid training program. If you talk to your parent doctor, there's now a Medicare code that allows them to prescribe the training program for you to become a better caregiver. And that's paid for by Medicare. So all of these support mechanisms are being put in place that I think will be a big benefit to caregivers in the future. Problems remain, but this is definitely going in the right direction. So if you want more program information about Guide, give me a call. My number's at the bottom of the second page, and we can talk about it. The other thing Tess could take advantage of was the state of Illinois has a program where they will pay a family member to be a caregiver. Now, there's some things that come with that. First of all, you have to be trained properly. So you typically work through an organization that trains you on being a better caregiving. What I've learned, if nothing else, over the years is caregiving comes naturally, just a very few people. Most of us need training in order to be better caregivers. So with this training, Tess can make an hourly wage to stay at home and care for her mother. Now, in where Tess and her mom lived, Catholic Charities was the third-party entity that helped hook people like Tess up to these programs. So if you need additional information, again, give me a call and we can kind of figure out where in your area there might be support. Now, most states have these programs, but some states like Florida, because I've worked with clients down there, some programs have long waiting lists. As you can imagine, this is a much needed program. But if you think about why is this being offered, it's actually a win-win situation. If I, as the state, can keep a person diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease at home, that's cheaper than putting them in a care facility. And if I can pay a family caregiver who has the time and willingness to provide care, that gives them a source of income. And that source of income is typically less than the state's going to pay to put the person in a healthcare nursing facility. So it makes sense to me that you offer this program. So we've done the care budget, we've done the benefits inventory, we've asked the right questions, we've identified plans that the financial caregiver and the individual diagnosed with the disease are eligible for. And then we create what I call the care balance sheet. That's where we take a look at all the assets the family has and decides of those assets, what might be available to help pay for care. Now, again, a lot of people are going to find out that they have few in the way of assets. Some people may own their own home, so that may be a source of funding. But with a caveat, we'll talk about that in a minute. They may have some retirement savings. In a lot of cases, those retirement savings are in a tax-favored account like an IRA. And if you pull them out to pay for care, you're going to have to pay taxes on it. So that might not be the best source of money. What about home equity, a reverse home mortgage, which many of you may have heard about, or a home equity loan. Now, this is where you get into the problem of what I mentioned before. If I mentioned getting a home equity loan or reverse mortgage, you'll get objections. Reverse mortgages had the reputation, although they're a little better now, for being very expensive in order to, and it was always recommended by the government that do it only as a last resort. Well, that's part of the analysis that goes into trust who you're working with, look at the costs of the reverse mortgage, and see if it makes sense in your family member's particular situation. The family member may object that, well, I paid off the home not to help pay for my care, but really just to own the home and be free of mortgage payments. But here again, we're looking at alternatives that are available. They may not be a great list of alternatives, but they may provide a source of paying for care. The other thing it can do, and let me give you another story. I had a client named Brian up in the Minneapolis area. His wife was a realtor. He worked for a large Fortune 500 company in the Minneapolis area. And his wife asked me, is there a way that we have enough money that I can stay home and take care of Brian during those last few months with ALS? And I said, my goal is to help you make decisions that you don't regret. In other words, this is something that many of us, fortunately, may only go through once. And we want to make sure that whatever decisions we make, we don't regret them. So I told Brian's wife that let me find the money and we'll figure out a way to keep you home to take care of Brian in the last few months of his life. She was able to do that. Brian died probably 4 years ago. She's always been happy that she was able to do that for him. And it wasn't easy to do. We got together a group from her church in the local neighborhood that volunteered to help take care of Brian and be there when Tess needed to leave or needed a respite break. But these are the challenges that I think are important for us to talk about during this planning process. What type of care does the loved one want? What can you provide? And how can we make changes to accommodate what we want to do and what we can do? That to me is the most important function that we can fill when we're working with a family, making those wishes, those desires come true. And that also, we talk about, there's some tension within all families between the ill spouse, the ill partner, and the family members. Often the ill person will say, I don't want you to bankrupt us taking care of me. Don't spend all the money that we saved and then you're left impoverished after my death. The family's response, of course, is you don't worry about that. We're going to take care of you as best we can. And don't worry about where the money's coming from or going to. What I always recommend to families, because it surprises me that this issue isn't discussed earlier in the process, but that's where the Alzheimer's Association can come in help. It can be very helpful to get a social worker, a trained social worker who can help discuss these issues. As a CPA, I'm not qualified to do that. But the Alzheimer's Association can provide support to help go through this discussion and deal with many other issues. Another issue that always surprised me is a lot of times families never talk about Alzheimer's being a terminal disease. I had a friend once, a couple, where the wife was diagnosed with early onset. I think she was diagnosed at age 59. And with early onset Alzheimer's, I think she lived maybe 4 or 5 years. But I asked her husband, Howie, after she had passed, early on, how did you talk about the disease? Now, this is probably in the year 2000, 2001. And at the time, Alzheimer's didn't nearly have the attention it does now. And Howie said, we never talked about, or we never even mentioned the term Alzheimer's disease. We called it her brain disease or sickness, but we always avoided the discussion. It really wasn't until the end, and with early onset Alzheimer's, people can tend to become somewhat agitated and violent towards the end. We really didn't talk about it being terminal till near the end of her life. Near the end of her life, they had to keep their grandchildren away from their grandma because they didn't want their last memories of her being in such an agitated state. So a lot of these issues are not discussed, and I think are best talked through with a social worker and involve the whole family. We've already talked about excuse me, Medicare and Medicaid and how their healthcare coverage decisions. Always remember dual eligibility. That's so often forgotten and not discussed or pursued adequately, in my opinion. The low income subsidy or extra help with prescription drug costs. Medicare Savings Program is also another program. It's Medicaid based and will get you additional financial support if you qualify. Now, by financial support, I don't mean most Medicare does not usually pay for custodial care, meaning you go to a nursing home and they help you with getting dressed, with eating, with medication management, with going to the bathroom. Those are considered personal care issues that are not paid for by Medicare, with just really two exceptions. The first is if you are in a nursing home as a result of a stay in a hospital, you can get up to 100 days of that type of care provided. The first 20 days are 100% paid for by Medicare. The last 80 days, you pay a co-payment. And the best way to avoid the co-payment is you have a Medicare supplement plan that steps in to pay that. That can be $300-400 a day for those last 80 days. So it can be expensive. So you want to look at your Medicare supplement plan. But beyond that, Medicare does not provide custodial care, with one other exception. If the person with Alzheimer's disease is homebound, and by homebound, I mean not that they can never leave their home, but it's very difficult for them to be moved out of the home, to go to the doctor, to go to a religious service. It requires extraordinary effort to get out of the house. They can actually have, if they have other pieces of care in place, a home health aide come to their home up to 35 hours per week and have that time paid for by Medicare. Now, I have a client in Paducah, Kentucky. He has a very rare form of a disease that means he's homebound, he needs care 24/7. And because he needs physical and occupational therapy delivered at home, and he has a physician's order, Medicare will provide a home health aide up to 35 hours per week to provide those type of personal services. Now, it doesn't cover, obviously, 24/7, but 35 hours is a big chunk of time that can be paid for by Medicare, and also can help relieve the caregiver, give the family member some time off so they can relax and undergo some stress reduction with the respite care. So keep in mind when you're talking about home care, you want to write this down. I put it in the outline. It's the JIMO decision. JIMMO is a court decision that is now 10 years old that told Medicare these rights, these benefits are available to Medicare beneficiaries, and you have to do a better job of communicating the availability of that right. Because in effect, Medicare was kind of hiding these rights and not letting Medicare beneficiaries know they're available. So write down JIMO, be aware that they exist. There are other requirements, but it's a great alternative for people who need some home health aid brought in during the week. We've talked about, again, Medicaid, dual eligible, and that Medicaid will pay out-of-pocket expenses that are not paid for by Medicare. Now, there's often confusion about this. There's two levels of Medicaid that are provided. One is the Medicaid that really helps pay for those Medicare expenses not covered or expected to be paid for by the family, by the beneficiary. And those will be going to the doctor, acute care, a hospital stay. The other Medicaid assistance is where you have to place your family member in a nursing home. That's where Medicaid will step in. And if the assets of the patient are low enough, income and assets, Medicaid will step in and pay for nursing home care. And that's, I think, what most people think of when they think of Medicaid. But Medicaid is a little more complex than that, but it does get you a stay at a nursing home facility. You're able to keep, I think, only about $50 per month for spending money. So it's a restrictive program, but it's an alternative. And keep in mind, many times when you're dealing with issues, you're really dealing with trying to reduce the anxiety of the caregiver, to let them know there are alternatives out there. There are problem-solving things we can do to help you through this process. It takes a little effort. It doesn't often solve all the problems, but it certainly gets you on the way to reducing your anxiety and realizing that there are alternatives available. All of this is in E. We want to understand federal, state, local, and private sources of assistance. We're going to talk about that in a minute. In part, that's been made easier because of the availability of the internet and being able to do searches, particularly for private sources of support that are often out there that people don't realize until they start doing internet searches. Let's talk about some other financial problems families have when they, at the same time, they receive an Alzheimer's diagnosis or a diagnosis for any chronic or terminal illness. Alzheimer's is particularly a problem in this area because when you lose your cognitive functions because of the Alzheimer's disease, often behavior changes. So we've all seen it where, say your mom and dad have been very prudent with their money throughout their life. They've saved their money, they've spent it wisely. Suddenly they're left alone. They're diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but the family doesn't become involved until many months or even a year go by. And what happens is the person, as they lose their cognitive function, they become less careful with their money. So now they're spending and charging to their credit card amounts they would have never done before. And by the time the family gets involved, they've run up $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 of credit card debt that in the past they would have never had. And the family gets involved and you have to deal with the debt. And then you have to ask yourself questions like, is the patient judgment proof? So what does judgment proof mean? most older people who have limited income and assets have limited sources of income because they get Social Security. Maybe they get a small pension. Well, if they've run up these significant debt, credit card debt, it's unsecured, meaning the lender can't come in and grab an asset. It's not like a mortgage. It's unsecured, but they can get a judgment in a court, but judgments don't apply to Social Security and to pensions. So it ends up they can get a judgment, but it's worth nothing to them. It's judgment proof. They can't get to that income stream. And we have used that in many circumstances where the only source of income is Social Security, and we'll have a large credit card company come to us and say, well, the mom owes $60,000. And we'll explain to the company that the only source of income available to this person is Social Security. They will recognize the person's judgment proof, and they will, in effect, drop the suit. The debt is forgiven because the credit card company, at least legitimate credit card companies, will realize getting the money is virtually impossible. Plus, going after poor older people does not look good in the newspaper. So they're judgment proof. And a lot of people aren't aware of this, but that's another problem solving approach that you can use. It's not always the best choice. I know a lot of people don't like to think they're going to renege on their judgment on debt, but often it's the only alternative. What about Medicare debt, medical care debt? Here I had a client who had gone through a bout of cancer. He didn't have a very good healthcare plan, and so was left with a lot of debt from the care related to his cancer. That was before he turned age 65. He turned age 65 and he was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease. So now he has high medical debt existing from a prior illness, and now the extraordinary bad luck of having Lou Gehrig's disease, which is also a very expensive disease because of the care needs of the patient. So what could he do? Well, we took care of the medical debt much the same way we did with credit card debt. We did approach the hospital, the healthcare facility, talk to them about his eligibility. Many hospitals have private foundations that will pay a portion of the medical care debt that's owed if the patient qualifies for it. So they were able to, they applied to the foundation. They got a big chunk of that debt paid off by the foundation, and then the balance was just forgiven. Now, the other problem with the oncoming costs of other debt, in this case, he had, was they were underwater with their home. In other words, the home was worth less than the outstanding mortgage. The only real alternative for this family was to go bankrupt. So we introduced him to a good bankruptcy attorney. They went through the bankruptcy process. They had to turn over their home. They were able to move. Now, the happy ending in the story, if you call it that, is the wife of the patient was actually a very well-known and very popular preschool teacher in the community she lived in the suburbs of Chicago. And this was only a few years ago. So they started a GoFundMe page. They raised enough that they were able to buy a van so that it could accommodate the wheelchair that was eventually needed for the patient because of his Lou Gehrig's disease. And they were also help provide living expenses for a time. He eventually died. It was a fairly aggressive form of ALS, but eventually passed away from it. So there was some good news, some innovative thinking. I think it was actually the wife's brother who thought of the idea. And I think they raised in a very short period of time $100,000 or more. So there are other alternatives available that good creative thinking may help. So we're talking about debt issues. We've talked about credit card debt, bankruptcy, talked about medical care debt and approaching the hospital, about forgiving the debt given circumstances. Can talk about other financial circumstances where, in this case, it was a mother was diagnosed at age 50 with Lou Gehrig's disease. She had 3 kids, married. Both she and her husband earned fairly substantial income, but like a lot of families, they managed to always spend more than they ever earned. So now she had to quit her job, and that lost her income went from $150,000 a year to about $25,000 a year on Social Security disability income. So that was obviously a tremendous blow to their income, their household income. Now, in addition to that, 2 of their 3 kids were still in high school. Their oldest was about to start college at a state school and had already applied for student loans before the diagnosis. So what we recommended to them was that they reapproach the financial aid office, provide proof of the diagnosis of Lou Gehrig's disease, and the school was able to provide additional financial aid. So he was able to go to school and not have to put that off. His mom did not want him to delay his trip. They lived in Illinois. Both his parents went to Ohio State. So that's where he was they wanted him to go to school. She did not want to interfere with his college plans. And that additional financial plan actually helped do that. I have another, a friend of mine, a client for 40 years, Terry, was dying of cancer. This was late last year. He was 75 years old. So you would think student loans are not an issue. But in Terry's case, he asked me, the last question he ever asked me was, I co-signed student loans for 2 of my 4 kids. The student loans are $130,000 that are still owed. What happens to that loan when I die? Now, Terry had Parkinson's disease, but he would not die of Parkinson's disease. He died with Parkinson's disease. What he actually had was cancer, and that would ultimately be the cause of his death. Now, we have people that we work on staff who are experts at student loans. Terry had signed a student loan called Parent Plus loan. He only signed it, not his wife, which was important. So when he died, the loan was forgiven. The loan is in effect priced to have that insurance element in it. So when we were able to tell Terry that, he was very relieved that the loan would disappear at his death. We also deal with there are housing issues. Some are kind of odd. In this case, Paula is 75 years old, very frail. Her son is 50. Andrew has a very rare form of muscular dystrophy. He cannot work. He cannot earn any type of income because his muscles are weakening, and it's very difficult for him to either to live alone and, in fact, to move or do anything. He never really worked during his life. He did a little bit, but not enough to be eligible for Medicare. He could not qualify on Paula, his mom's Medicare, nor on his dad's Medicare. His dad was dead. And so Paula, because of her poverty, was able to get what used to be called Section 8 housing. But her only housing option was in an assisted living facility that only allowed people age 55 and older to live there. So they did not let Andrew move in to stay with his mom. Andrew needed housing assistance, so we had to get him on the waiting list. Now that took a while, but in the meantime, Andrew did attend a fairly large church in the western suburbs, and the church members were able to give Andrew a place to live until he finally got, I think it probably took about a year to get the housing assistance he needed. But until that year was up, families would have Andrew move in for a week or two and then it'd move. So we made sure he had housing and was taken care of. So housing, student loans, debt are all issues that you have to learn to deal with because of the diagnosis of these diseases. Let me talk briefly about now the benefits of early planning. I think for most people it's obvious, but most people don't do that. Plus, there is only so much value you can do with early learning, right? You never know the date. All sorts of problems, as you see, arise that you really can't plan for. But we've entered a period where there are now 2 drugs that help slow the progress of Alzheimer's disease. The first one was approved, Leqembi, back in July of 2022, approved by the FDA. It is paid for by Medicare. Kesimpta was just approved a few weeks ago. That will also be paid for by the FDA. Neither is a cure, but they do slow progression of the disease. Now, they're also very expensive. But what most people don't understand, where the confusion is these drugs are not paid for by Medicare Part D, which covers prescription drugs, but is paid for by Medicare Part B because they're in drugs that are infused. In other words, you go to an infusion center or you go to the doctor's office to have the IV put in your arm in order to have the medical personnel oversee delivery of the drugs. So Part B will pay for it. Now, the newest drug for a 48-month treatment period costs about $40,000. That's this number here. Medicare will pay, Medicare Part B will pay for 80% of it, or, I'm sorry, it costs almost $50,000. They'll pay 80% of it, or about $40,000. The beneficiary will pay 20%, or almost $10,000. That is not cheap. That's not cheap for most people. Medicare supplement will pay that cost. If you have a Medicare Advantage plan, you want to double check that that will pay that 20%. Many of the Medicare Advantage plans will not pay for it. You have to double check. As with any drug, you want to talk to your doctor about the side effects. I was actually in the Eli Lilly testing for the new drug, but because I was taking blood thinners, one of the side effects to these drugs are brain bleeds. They thought the drug, and I was only, I didn't know, at the time, I didn't know if I was getting the actual drug or placebo, but they decided I was too at risk to continue in the study. So they kicked me out of the study, and I'm no longer in it, but you want to check with your doctor. If you want more information, you go to morethannormalaging.lilly.com and learn more about it. We've talked about some of these important family issues that come up, the money tension between patient doesn't want a lot of money spent. The family wants to spend as much as needed. And there I suggested a social worker can help talk through that. Survivor planning is always difficult. And that's where you sit down with the spouse and talk about what's going to be left after the death of your loved one. How are you going to survive financially? What planning do we need to do for you to make you less anxious about that period. The searching for support, there are private foundations you can find on the internet. One I particularly like, Clarity for Charity, was started by Seth Rogen and his wife. I think they lost both of their parents to Alzheimer's. And there you can or receive a grant for respite care. In other words, a caregiver can get a amount of money to pay for a caregiver to come in, watch the patient for a weekend, have money to go on a trip, and just get away from a very stressful situation. Also, the ACL.gov, the Administration for Community Living, is also a great source of information for respite care and other sources of funding. Don't forget Alzheimer's.org is a great source of information and care. We talked about Guide. The last thing I want to mention is thinking about what happens if the caregiver can no longer provide care. That often happens. Either caregiver gets sick, or may pass away. You have to think about what's going to happen in that circumstance. Who can step in and help? And it does, unfortunately, happen. Next year, for next 2025, use the period from October 15th to December 17th, which is called the open enrollment period, which is also called the annual enrollment period, to review the Medicare coverage of the ill spouse or partner and see if that's adequate for 2025. You can make changes during that period without answering health questions. This is absolutely crucial to make sure you look at the coverage and decide whether changes are necessary. So you have from October 15th to December 7th to do that. The other big change next year, it's a great change. It used to be in the past, Part D prescription drug coverage did not have a maximum out of pocket. Next year, there will be a maximum. It's $2,000. Still a lot of money for many families, I know. And you can also smooth that payment out if you approach the insurance company and say, I would like to pay a fixed amount of money each month. In this case, $2,000 divided by 12 is $167. Then I want to pay smoothly throughout the year, so I am not hit by a big bill either at the beginning of the year because of the deductible or at the end of the year because of the way Part D works. So we have some good changes happening in 2025. This is my 800 number, an extension, my email address. We are a nonprofit organization. We do try to make scholarships available for callers who can't afford our fees, but we'll work with you on that. So call me if you have any other questions. I appreciate the time you've given me today, and hopefully you've learned a little bit about problem solving when you get a diagnosis for Alzheimer's disease or other dementia, and this will help you move forward. I can stay on and take other calls, or if you want to call me later or send me an email with questions, I'm perfectly happy to do that.
Thanks, Jim. I've gotten a couple of people saying just thank you in the chat. And I wanted to remind everyone that I emailed this sheet that Jim's been working on. I emailed it to the email that you all registered for this program through. So if you want to take a look at this along with his contact information, should you have additional questions that you think of later, reach out to him. I'm sure he's very easily, I've never had trouble communicating with him. I'll just say that. So if you don't have any questions, I very much appreciate your time. And thanks to you, Mr. Sullivan, for, again, your expertise. And we'll do this again sometime. I'm going to record it and I'll let everybody know when it's up and available to share on our YouTube channel. All right.
Great. Thank you, Ashley.
right, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye.